So we preached about hell this morning, and so tonight I'm going to move to the other side. The blessed are those that come into the Father's house, and so I'm going to talk to you about victory. And I'm going to look over in 1 Samuel chapter number 14 to get us started. In 1 Samuel chapter number 14, now for those of you that are Bible read, you'll realize this is under the leadership of King Saul, the first king of Israel. And here we come in quite a contrasting chapter here. King Saul had been put into place because Israel had asked God to give them an earthly king. And God told them they didn't need an earthly king. He was their king, and they needed to follow him. And he had given them judges. And that's how you come through the book of Joshua and Judges there. And so when you get into 1 and 2 Samuel here, by the 8th chapter, it begins where they want a king so they can be like all the other nations. And so God gives them a king. Now, listen to me, Christian. Be careful what you ask God for, because God might give it to you. And there's a lot of cases you think you know better, but you're going to find out God's right. And Israel finds this out, but it's a journey, many years, and many failures come because they do not heed the counsel of God. But they have an earthly king here. And so in that sequence of events there in the 8th chapter, King Saul is chosen by God. Then chapter 9, chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, you'll come there where Nashon and the Amorites come against Jezebel, Gilead. And the Amorites are going to come up against them and defeat them. And so King Saul is out in the field plowing with a team of oxen. And so he divides that team of oxen up, butchers it up, and sends those pieces of that oxen all across the land. And he threatens all the tribes of Israel that if any of them don't come and protect their brethren that is there in Gilead, then they are going to be treated the same way this oxen, and they'll be torn asunder. And so 330,000 men come out of all the different 12 tribes of Israel and gather together with Saul, and they go up against the Amorites, and they defeat the Amorites, and boy, everything just goes their way in that first battle. And they are just so pleased with their earthly king. Now, the prophet Samuel's still around at this time. His death hasn't happened yet. And the prophet Samuel cautions them that not to think too highly of that, because it was not King Saul. It wasn't the 330,000 men that had delivered Israel. It was God. And they were too optimistic about their earthly standing. And many nations throughout the Scriptures fall into that same place. They prosper and they think they did it. But God removes His hand from a nation, the nation soon falls. And Israel was in the midst of this. And so they were very optimistic and everything was going their way. And they thought that they were going to be spared. Their king was going to be a great king. And so by the time you come to chapter 12 of 1 Samuel there, they find themselves in a very good place. But then in the 13th chapter, it begins to change quickly. And now the Philistines come into the scene, and the Philistines are now pouring out into the land of Israel, and they're oppressing them, and they've taken all their weaponry away from them, and the Philistines make them buy their agricultural tools from them, and they are only can be sharpened by the Philistines. And so and they got bands coming across the land there, stealing and robbing from the Israelites. And so King Saul, again, he sends out a notice that all the men should gather together. But this time, when everybody gathers back together, he just sent them home after that great victory against the Amorites. But now they come back against the Philistines, because the Philistines are now pouring out against them. And as they come back against the Philistines, well, not as many show up. And then they realize how many Philistines they are, and a bunch of those desert. And even some of them even defect and go over to the Philistine side. And now Saul is sitting in Migon, and he's underneath the shade tree, and he's only got 600 men with him. And now they're in a real complexity, because that victory that they had against the Amorites in chapter 9 and 10 now looks pretty small against this massive force of these Philistines. And the Philistines have the iron chariots, they have the iron wheels, they have the swords, they have the spears, and Israel have 2 swords amongst the whole tribes. And here we find King Saul, and he's in this dilemma, and now he's trying to figure out what to do, how to get to this place. And I really don't see him in a place where he's really trying to figure anything out. He really acts like just sitting underneath that shade tree waiting for something good to happen. Because there's, this thing's really bad. I mean, I got 600 people. I had 330,000. Now I got 600. I guess I should have threatened them first. That worked real well last time. Maybe that's what I should have done. But they didn't show up, and so now he's in a real bind, and he's trying to figure out what to do. And so while he is waiting there, then all these guys start to defect, and these other ones are hiding underneath the rocks, keeping themselves hid from the Philistines. And so the prophet Samuel don't show up in time, so Saul decides he's going to offer up the burnt offering. He's also going to get ready to do the peace offering, but Samuel stopped him from that. But he decides, well, I'll just offer up this burnt offering, and I'll take care of this thing and get this thing in order, and I'll get moving against these Philistines before I lose any more people. And he come up with this plan, and then Samuel shows up and rebukes him. He doesn't buy his justification, and there we find that he had overstepped his bounds as king. He had no right to offer sacrifice unto God. And now we find that God removes his hand from Saul. And he's going to take care of moving him out from the kingdom. Now listen to me. And I think it happens, and we're in those days right now in America today. Many politicians and many judges are overstepping their position as politicians and judges. And it's going to destroy our nation. Because there has to be a check and a balance here. And when Saul decides he's going to take care of the job of the prophet, God says, you're done. Because God appoints you to do his purpose and his will. But when you get out of God's purpose and God's will, it's going to be your downfall. And that's where Saul had come to at this point. And so then he moves on to the shade tree and waits there, because now everything's just coming apart on him. And he's just trying to figure out what to do next. So in the midst of that, we come to chapter 14, where we're going to find our text this evening. And in that, we find that Jonathan shows up, and Jonathan begins to see and understand what God is doing here, and how the Philistines need to be taken care of, and that God's going to remove them because they are Gentiles. They are not part of the covenant people of Israel. And these Philistines do not belong in Canaan land. God's people belong in Canaan land. And so we find here that Jonathan begins to search and find out what God's going to do. And we find the Philistines are now set up post at Michmash, and they are there on the one side guarding this pass, so that no one can get to them without coming down through this pass. And so these sentries are up there on the one side. And Jonathan tells his armor bearer, he said, we're going to go over there and see if God will deliver them into our hand. So Jonathan and his armor bearer decides to go over and expose themselves to the Philistines and see if God's going to take care of this situation. And exactly what God's will was in this. Now, it was overwhelming odds, but listen to me, when God's on your side, it does not matter who's against you. Right. And that's where we're coming to here in 1 Samuel chapter number 14. Now this is an impossible mission because of where they had found themselves at now. Now it was no longer about man. It was no longer about what man could do. It was about what God was going to do. And a lot of times, Christian, God will put you into a place, or put the nation into a place where we find ourselves in need of a mighty miracle of God. It's nothing that we're going to be able to solve these things with. Militarily speaking, this was a very hopeless situation. Like I said, in giving you that background, when you come up to this point, you know, you got 600 Israelites sitting here under this pomegranate tree in Migon, and Saul is just sitting there with his arm folded, kicked back in a lawn chair going, oh my, this is bad. Gee, we wiped out the Amorites, but these Philistines, and he's got all this stuff whirling around in his head, but he can't figure it out. Jonathan said, well, I'm going to go do something about it. So his plan is to go over and climb down the one side and get down to the bottom of Michmash Passage there, and then let the Philistines seek him in his armor bearer, and they're going to figure out whether it's God's plan for them to go up or for the Philistines to come down and wipe them out. So that don't sound like much of a plan. Well, sometimes you just got to trust God to do something great in your life. Find your place in 1 Samuel chapter number 14. Let's begin reading in verse 6. Here's the great victory. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. For it may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. And his armor bearer said unto him, do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee. Behold, I am with thee, according to thine heart. Then said Jonathan, behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. And if they say thus unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up unto them. But if they say, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. Verse 11. And both of them discovered themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews have come forth out of the holes, and they have hidden themselves. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer, and said, come up unto us, and we will show you a thing. Now that's not a good thing, folks. They had intended bad things here. Say, well, they were nice. They said, come on up here. You got to read there a little bit. You understand what they're saying. So the Philistines said unto them, come up unto us, and we'll show you a thing. And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them unto the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. And the first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men. And within as it was a half acre of land which a yoke of oxen might plow. And there was a trembling in the host of the field, and among all the people, and the garrison, and the spoilers, and they also trembled, and the earthquake, and it was very great trembling. And the watchmen of Saul in Gibead of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went on beating down one another. Now here in this discourse, you'll find the events that took place as Jonathan began to seek God and began to see the things that God was doing. And he was willing to see how that God was going to work this thing out. Though Saul and his 600 men were sitting there underneath the shade tree and waiting it out, they had no knowledge of what Jonathan, his armor bearer, was doing. They're on this foray all on their own. He didn't go to the king and ask the king if the king thought he ought to go up there to the garrison. He didn't ask any of his buddies. In fact, if you'll read on down there, you'll find that they didn't even know what had happened until all the Philistines began to fall up there. The earth began to quake, and they began to kill each other and to destroy each other. And then Saul calls to have all the men numbered and find out who's missing. And he finds out Jonathan, the armor bearer, is missing. But up to that time, he had no clue what was going on. And so Jonathan and the armor bearer went out, and they went down to this valley they crawled down in there, and they showed themselves, and they waited to see what God was going to do. And there was definitely a sense of God's will in all this. He was prompted to act. He knew exactly what his heart was. He understood the consequences of what could happen. But he said that if God was going to be on their side and God gave them a victory, God can give you a victory whether there's few or whether there's many. It is not the numbers. It's not the size or the resources we have. It's about what God's doing and how God's going to work this out. It's God's plan. God's plan was for Israel to inherit the land under the Davidic covenant, under the Abrahamic covenant, under the Abrahamic covenant, and under that covenant, that it was Israel's place to take the land. And friend, when God promises you something, God will do what God promises. So Jonathan knew exactly where they should be. He knew the Philistines didn't belong there. And so therefore, he looked up to see what God was going to do about this. Now, these Philistines, as they come to this point, and they begin to understand exactly what was happening here, they had a whole different idea. And I warn you often, I mentioned it this morning, I mentioned about education and the television set and the internet and all that stuff, and I talk to you about it all the time. Listen, the world sees things much differently than God's people sees things. You got the same thing. You got the Philistines standing up here looking down. You got Jonathan and the armor bearer down here. They done crawled down this one side, and they got clear down in that belly, and they looked up. And they were waiting to hear what God was going to do with this thing. The Philistines think, man, I got this thing whooped. These guys are trapped. We can easily kill them anytime we want to kill them. So you come on up here, we'll show you a thing. They were pretty arrogant fellas. They held the pass. That these 20 that were there within that half-acre ground were lookouts to all the multitude of the Philistines that were back behind them. They could sound the trumpet at any time and gather all their troops together. Israelites were all hid out in the rocks. Many of them had defected. Many of them had now come to join the Philistines, and so they thought everything was going their way. They thought they had everything under control. So they looked down there, and there's just two of those little old Jews down there in the valley. He said, look, they crawled out of their hole. Silly Jews. Why would you crawl out of your hole? Why aren't you hiding out with the rest of those guys? How come you're not under the shade tree with King Saul? They tried to figure out all these things going on down there. So they said, come on up here. And Jonathan knew that God had opened him a door. It was an opportunity. It was those things that God had said to him. Because he knew that if God was going to give them victory, they would beckon them to come up. Now you also understand this. This faith was a matter of risk here. Because if the Philistines started to come down, Jonathan and his armor bearer had no place to go. This could have been as great a destruction. This could have ended their lives. The Philistines could have had their way and could have easily killed Jonathan and his armor bearer at any time. And yet, they climb up on their hands and knees. They go up the side of this great valley, this great mountainside there, and then they climb up the other side. They move up to where the Philistines are. They are finding themselves in the midst of this thing. They understand that God is going to do this for them. Now, Jonathan had the other iron sword that the Israelites had, and so he was therefore slaying these Philistines as he come up there in this half-acre of ground there, and him and his armor bearer had wiped out 20 of them as they went across that land. And now these things quickly began to change, and we quickly see that this thing is going in their direction. You think, well, what are they going to do about the rest of these Philistines? Well, if you read on down there, you understood this. God then began to send this earthquake, and the earthquake moved. This Michmash, this mountaintop, this lookout point, this valley that the Philistines, these uncircumcised that didn't belong in the land, what they thought was their protection became their doom. The land began to move and to quake, and it began to roll back and forth. And the Philistines come out of their tents and out of their eating places and out of their armory where they had put together all this protection, and they had this great plan. But when the ground that they were now standing on began to quake and move and shake, they began to kill each other. They were literally destroying themselves. And Jonathan and his armor bearer were just standing there watching as the ground began to quake and the Philistines began to kill themselves, and they began to destroy themselves in a panic. If you'll study the scriptures out, many times God uses a panic of a nation to destroy itself. You can go over and over again. You can think about Gideon and the 300 men that he had. And as he stood up there that night, and they broke the pitchers and they sounded the trumpets, and there again you'll find the great move of God as God caused panic down there. And folks, when you watch the things that are going on in this nation, you watch these people, it's not going to take much to panic America today. People are going to, they're going to lose sight. All their great plans come to a great halt immediately when God sends a great move, a great understanding of something that they have no knowledge of what was going to go on. They could not see, they did not believe, they didn't have confidence that God was going to do something. And so this panic came. This security became their downfall. And now the Philistines are running about to and fro and killing each other. And now Saul and his priest down there, Ai, as he's down there, and they got the ephod where they could have discerned what God was doing but did not. They didn't ask anything of God. They began to look up and they see all this panic going on up there in Michmash, and all these Philistines falling and dying up there. And so then the priest and Saul gets together, and you go over there and read that, and as you read on down through the chapter there, and they begin to discuss this thing, and then God moves into that point in time, and this thing is becoming a matter that Jonathan and the armor bearer are victors, and then old Saul decides, hey, I think we can go up there now. Looks like a good time to move now. Since God's undone it all, we'll go up and get the spoils. So he gets his 600 men together, and they head it on. And they see the great victory. Now here's the lesson here, folks. Here's where we begin to see there's several things that we can gain from this discourse that he gives us over here in 1 Samuel chapter number 14. I think that as you look over this thing, there's great instruction for us as Christians in spiritual leadership. You'll find here that God will show you there's two ways to live your life. You can find there, as we explained to you, we went over the chapters there in 1 Samuel, chapter number 8 down through chapter number 14 there, and you'll find that there are those times where you've got to find that faith to stand and to know what God's doing. There's two different types of leadership here in their faith. See, Saul became a man of great fear. You know, over in chapter number 13 there, he decides he can't wait on the prophet to come offer the sacrifice because he's losing too many men, and the Philistines are going to flee, or the Philistines are going to overcome them, and the Philistines are going to take over. And so Saul says, we can't wait, we got to make a burnt offering. I'm afraid. But in chapter 14, I only got 600 people. Oh, no, we can't go against the Philistines. He allowed fear to control his life. He allowed the circumstances and others and the things that he could figure out, he was putting those before God. He was not concerned with what God wanted, where God wanted him to be, what God had placed him there to do. He didn't look at the purpose of God in his life. He allowed fear to control him. And folks, we find that so often in our human life. We allow our fears to control us. Well, what if this happens, and what if that happens, and what if this doesn't work out, and what if I don't have enough money, and what if I don't have enough health, and what if I don't have enough time, and what if I don't have my father? Unless God blesses you with whatever you need, you're not going to have enough anyways. You can't sit around and allow fear to entrap you, to keep you and paralyze you, or to cause you to do things that you should not be doing. And there's a great lesson there. On the other side of that is Jonathan. Now, Jonathan had faith and works. Jonathan understood that the Philistines did not belong in the land. And when you come to chapter 14, it is Jonathan that steps up. And Jonathan says, if God will, we can take them. Now, Jonathan stepped out by faith. And his armor bearer followed him. And God gave them a great victory. Now, there's many things to see within that. You know, when Saul stood up in fear, it was contagious amongst his followers. They hid in the rocks. Many of them deserted and went back home. Others defected unto the Philistine side. Friend, when you lead by fear, you spread fear to others. Many households are consumed by fear today. And they allow that fear to consume them. And there's no spiritual insight in that place. Many businesses are run by fear today. Our government is run by fear today. And that fear is controlling us. But the other side of that is when you find faith and you'll find works where you're willing to step out and be obedient, that is also contagious. When Jonathan said, I'm going to go down and see what God will do, and if God gives me freedom to go up there and to stand against those Philistines, I will go up. You know what the armor bearer said? Do what's in your heart. When Jonathan starts up that mountain, you know who's behind him? The armor bearer. Because faith breeds faith. It spreads it. It allows that faith to step out there and to see and to know that you can trust it and you can put your effort into that. And that's going to allow us to see that. And too often in our homes today or in the church today or in the business today, we're not finding people of faith to say, let's pray and see what God wants us to do. Let's step up. And if God says this, He will deliver us. But Jonathan, how are we going to get up there? Well, we'll climb up on our hands and knees. Wow, wait a minute. Do you realize they can chuck that spear down and stick you while you're trying to get up that rock? I mean, you're putting yourself out just open market. They can kill you anytime they want. And besides that, they're smug enough they think they're going to show you a thing or two. Come on up here, we'll show you a thing. It don't make sense, folks. It's not logical. It's not, okay, we got a business plan here that's going to work. It's because we trust God. God gave them a sign. God said, this is what you need to do. And if they say, come on up, God's going to deliver them to us. So whatever obstacle was between them and that Philistines no longer was an obstacle. It was a path to victory. But you got to walk down that path, or sometimes crawl down that path. You got to get on all fours and climb on up that rock. Say, oh, this is difficult. Wait till you get to the top. You're going to see God do something great. But until you're willing to climb up there, you're never going to see God do anything. Say, but there's 20 up there. There's 2 of us. I believe that's 10 to 1 odds. That ain't good, folks. But God's with us. That's victory. And Jonathan overcome those things because he believed in faith and he trusted in that faith and he stepped out by that faith and he's seen the victory be won. And that's where we have to find ourselves. That's where God leads us. It's the faith that allows God to give us the discernment to know what His will is for our life, to know that we can trust Him, to attract others to follow what God's doing in our life. Also, you'll find that application that faith takes action. You got to step out and do the things that God has told us to do when God tells us to do them. Listen, God chose Saul back over in chapter number 8, set him up as king, placed him there over the Amorites, and allowed Israel to have victory there. Had 330,000 soldiers with him, and they could have easily defeated the rest of the land, wiped out the Philistines and ran them off. But they got complacent about their victory, and they sent everybody else home. And now the Philistines then began to dominate again, and the Philistines now move upon the land of Israel. And now they need to step back up, and they need to come into this place. And instead of knowing that it was God's timing, instead of seeking God, Saul, he had a priest. He had an ephod there that was carrying it along. That ephod allowed them to discern God's will and to know it was that which came in the Ark of the Covenant there and the part of the tabernacle that allowed them to see and to know God's faith. And instead of seeking God, they sat under the pomegranate tree, whining and complaining and fearful and paralyzed by their fear and doing nothing. It's hard for us to understand in human rationale of how we end up in these places. How do we get ourselves here? Because we get impatient with God and we quit listening to God and we start doing it our own way. And instead of turning to God, we turn away from God. When God gave them the victory, and now they decide they're going to go against the Philistines, instead of seeking after God, instead of waiting for God's man to get there, the prophet Samuel to get there, and to offer the sacrifices and discern God's will, to know the things of God for the people against Israel, for God to gather up the people, Saul gets impatient. But then when he gets over to chapter 14, then he wants to do nothing. Now, in case you haven't figured it out, human beings are fickle human beings. They are the most independable things on this earth. Just the time you think you understand what they're going to do, they'll do the opposite. Why? Because they live by fear and not by faith. They, instead of stepping out and continuing to follow God, after they get the victory over the Amorites, then they decide they're going to do it their way. And God says, that's it. I'm going to remove my hand from you. You're no longer going to be king. And Saul said, I'm still king. I stand here. He tries to gather the people back together. He tries to do the things he thinks he ought to be doing. And then the people don't show up. And then he goes into depression and sits underneath the pomegranate tree and does nothing. Sits there, does not seek God, does not allow the priest to seek God, does not look to see what Samuel has to say. He does absolutely nothing. And folks, you'll never find a victory doing nothing. It's not going to accomplish anything. And he was impatient when he needed to be patient, and he was inactive when he needed to be active. And that created Saul his problem. On the other side of that, the other lesson is Jonathan. Jonathan followed his father and the king and served in the Israel army when there's a great army. And God gave them the victory. But Jonathan also realized it was God that gave the victory. So now when there is no great army, now there's only 600 men, and now there's inactivity, and now they're sitting by the pomegranate tree. Jonathan says, let's go see what God's going to do. I'll step out and allow God to do what God's going to do. Now, Jonathan didn't go charging up the hill and run over there to Michmash and jump up there on those garrison and say, I'm going to take you. He said, God's going to deliver Israel. I'll wait on God and see what God's going to do. He goes down into the valley of the pass there, And then he exposes himself, he shows himself he's discovered there by the Philistines. And as they're discovered there, it's not what the Philistines were doing, it's what God was telling Jonathan. The Philistines were speaking one word, God was telling Jonathan something different. There's faith. There's the matter of truth. There's understanding. There's where we come to. If we're going to watch God work in our life, we got to step out and we got to see that which God's doing. We got to understand that and we got to follow that. We cannot get impatient. Impatience has always brought destruction to God's people. I could go many places in the Scripture. I don't have time tonight, but think about these. You know, when God told Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, and this child would come, and they got older and older and older, and the child didn't come, the child didn't come, the child didn't come. So then they decided, well, we'll work it out our own. So Sarah comes up with Hagar, and she gives Hagar to Abraham, and they have a son. His name's Ishmael. You know who Ishmael's the father of? Islam. You know what Islam's doing for Israel right now? Same thing they've done from the very beginning. They're creating all kinds of conflict. And it all came back because they were impatient and they did not wait. They did not see that God was going to work these things out. It's in God's timing. It's not in our timing. Saul got ahead. He offered the burnt offering, and then he lost his kingdom. He lost his power because he chose to go against the things of God. That's the understanding here, is that we have to let God work these things out. God shows himself there in Samuel 14 and how that he is working all these things out. It is that which brought this victory. And it wasn't just Jonathan and the armor bearer. Reread this week. When they got up there, they only killed 20 men. Now that's not a small feat. Don't get me wrong, folks. That's a great victory for two guys with one sword to kill 20 of these guards. And these guards watched them climb all the way up the side of this mountain. On their hands and on their knees, they climbed up to the top there. They had plenty of time. They could have summoned a whole bunch of Philistines to be ready for them. But they thought, oh, we got this. They're just 2 of them, 20 of us. We're up here. They're going to be all wore out. They're just weak little Israelites. They can't have anything to do by the time they get here. When they crossed over that top and they begin to slay those Philistines, 20 of them died. Now that's a big victory. But folks, the Philistines killed each other more than Jonathan and the armor bearer killed them. You know why? Because God sent the earthquake. God moved around, and they are synchronized in one side or the other, and they're thrusted back and forth. And in the midst of that storm, and in the midst of the thrusting back and forth, the confusion come, the panic come, and all the Philistines killed each other. And that's what brought the great victory. Now there's also, you know, if you go on through 1 Samuel there, get on down to 1 Samuel chapter 31, it's the Philistines that continue to pursue against Saul. It is the Philistines that literally brings him to the point of death where he kills himself because he was wounded in a battle there against the Philistine. The rest of his life he had to deal with it. In fact, if you read the 1 Samuel there, you'll find that the Philistines built up a great army because of what had happened there at Michmash, because of Jonathan and the armor bearer and the 20 men that were killed, and then all those that were killed in that destruction. But the victory, my friend, was God's. God brought it to pass. God said Saul would be done. Saul was done. David was going to come in to be king. Now, it's going to take a while to get there, but the victory belonged to God. And God's will and God's way would be done. Listen, Christian, we have to live by faith and not by fear. We have to wait on God when God says to wait on God. And we have to follow God when God says act. We have to be the people of God that does the things that God teaches us to do. It's up to God. It's not up to us. Let me close over in Romans chapter number 11. Will you please? Romans in the 11th chapter. Let me draw the last conclusion here. As you look at this chapter, you begin to understand this spirit-filled life, this understanding of what God's doing, how God's going to work, how God is the one that's going to do it. He closes out here the 11th chapter of Romans, as he gives us understanding of it is the power of God in our life. If we're going to walk by faith, if we're going to act by faith, if we're going to be obedient to see the victory, God's got to do it. Chapter 11, verse 33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments. His ways are past finding out. For who he hath known the mind of the Lord? Or who hath been his counselor? Or who hath first given to him that it may be recompensed unto him?" What he's saying there, listen, nobody earns what God gives. God gives because God's greater than all of us. God's the one that has the power. God's the one that has the might. God's the one that has the eternal plan. Now watch verse 36, Romans 11. "For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen." When it's all said and done, God's going to get the glory. God's the one. It wasn't Jonathan, it wasn't the armor bearer. It was that they were following what God told them to do. They were walking by faith, crawling by faith. They stepped up and fought the Philistines by faith. And God gave them the victory. Christian, if you're going to step out tonight and you're going to do something great for God, you're going to have to step out by faith and act by faith and depend on God to give you the victory. You're not going to fix the problem. So I'll just go over here with Saul and sit underneath the pomegranate tree. Got 600 guys sitting around doing nothing, hiding in the rocks. Oh, those Philistines, oh, they're up there on top of Michmash. Oh, man, we are in a bad, bad place. Woe is us. Wasn't for bad luck, we'd have no luck at all. Oh, mercy. What are we going to do? Jonathan says, "Come on, bud. Let's see if God will do something for us." He said, "Well, if that's in your heart, let's go." They go crawling down there. They get down to the bottom. And they discover themselves into those Philistines. And you know what God said? "Come on up, boys. It's time. These guys are gone. Their plan will not stand." Listen, every man on this earth that denies God, denies the power of God, denies the purpose of God upon this earth, they will not last. Say, "Oh, but preacher, they got the big houses. They got all those cars. They got these big businesses. And they come by and get all my money. They're taxing me to death. They run the hospitals. They run the doctor's offices. They run all the financing companies. They run all these things. They got all this worldly goods." But I told you this morning, they're going to stand before the righteous judge, Jesus Christ himself. And they're going to be either on the right hand or the left hand. And if they're on the right hand, they're going to hear, "Blessed, blessed, come, ye of my Father." But if they're on the left hand, friend, they're going to hear, "Cursed, depart from me." Those are going to be cast into the everlasting fire. It's not going to be, well, how big was your house? All they got's bigger dust bunnies. They didn't got nothing more than you got. Wow. They had 9 cars. They can only drive 1. It don't matter how many cars they got in their garage. They can only drive 1. Besides that, you get that big, somebody else drive it for you. You don't have to drive it. You got all that stuff. But they still got to stand before God. Folks, we come down to this thing. It's the understanding. How are you going to choose to live your life? Are you going to live in victory or are you going to live in defeat? If you're going to live in victory, you're going to have to choose to live by faith. Trust God. Say, "Oh, that's impossible." nothing is impossible with God. Well, that's not good military tactics. Nothing is impossible with God. God can give you the victory. I'm going to ask Brother Bob just stay where he's at. I'm just going to ask you to bow your heads. Ask Brother Jerry to start the invitation song. Just give you a moment just to set and consider. Frank, slow her down a bit, guys. Understand that you're either going to choose to live by faith or you're going to live by fear. And folks, if you're going to live by faith, you're going to see the victory. But you've got to get up and do what God's asking you to do. Just spend some time with the Lord and ask God what He wants you to have out of this message tonight. What's God speaking to you about? What's your micmash past? What are you going to have to trust God to do in your life this week?